Everyone, welcome to our seminar this morning. I'm Christopher Singh. I'm a partner in the Freeths employment team. Just some housekeeping before we kick off. If for any reason you lose a connection this morning, you can click on the original invite in the email we sent you. It'll bring you straight back in. Also, we will hopefully have some time for questions at the end of the speakers today. And there's a Q&A function in Zoom. It's the speech bubble at the bottom of your screen. Please put any questions you have in there, and we'll try and deal with as many as we can. If we don't get to all of them, we'll come back to you individually after the event. So, getting the most from your staff. I have a confession to make here. I'm often asked what I'm going to talk about at upcoming seminars, and also to try and say what the topic and title is going to be. This is one I've got wrong, I think, because in hindsight, getting the best from your staff sounds a bit exploitative, and this isn't about manipulating your staff. This event's about creating a healthy culture and working relationships. And as a result, I have come up with a separate title, which is Workplace Culture and Wellbeing, some suggestions. And those suggestions are about getting the best for your staff and the best from them. And it's all centered on a premise that you get the best from your staff if your culture is rooted in trust, collaboration, and transparency. And lawyers will always tell you that transparency is rooted in clear contracts of employment and policies to manage all the expectations. So in terms of the agenda, the framework this morning is something I'm going to be touching upon. That's a framework in which staff are currently operating, including employment contracts and policies that I just mentioned. I'm delighted to be joined by two speakers from Meraki HR this morning. Emma Browning, who's a senior HR professional and the founder of Meraki HR. Emma will be looking at the importance of considering different approaches to management staff in these very changed times. Also, she'll look at having difficult conversations and the strategies for those during periods of significant change. And also LLoyd, who's a chartered psychologist and psychotherapist. Lisa's an employee wellbeing expert, and she'll be giving all of us some tips and strategies for improving employee wellbeing and engagement, which is probably needed more than ever as a large number of staff continue to work remotely for the foreseeable future. So, turning to the framework in which your employees operate. In terms of the practical reality, you may have noticed that lots of people are working from home. And before the pandemic, a very small proportion of people worked from home, and there was lots of reasons why more people didn't. Some more people wanted to, often on occasion, and employers and organisations had lots of reasons why that wasn't possible. Now, all those reasons have disappeared because IT has been mobilised like never before. I think one of the underlying reasons for it could have been trust, but employers have been forced to embrace it, and in many cases, trust has been earned over 3 lockdowns. In terms of the statutory framework, we know there's been a right to request flexible working for some time, and that enabled employees to work more flexibly, and that could be working from home, changing their hours or more flexible hours. But there's never been a right to work more flexibly, just a right for it to be considered. I'm not going to spend much time looking, well, actually any time, considering the mechanism of flexible working or the law around it. But I'll just say, if you haven't got a flexible working policy in place, you really should. I want to look beyond the request for flexible working because I'm going to suggest to you that the onus isn't on the employee here anymore. There's a real benefit on the employer taking ownership and leadership of those sort of conversations in the current circumstances. Employers now will be considering what permanent changes, if any, it may need to make into how people are expected to work in the future. Because if there are changes, that creates uncertainty and that creates uncomfortable situations for employees. But this state of confusion and uncertainty can be managed by employers. And I'm going to talk to you about how that can potentially be managed. And you might be doing these things already. The first is starting to assess now how your business will operate in the future. Get your crystal ball out and start planning. There was a huge panic, I think, initially at the start of the pandemic with what's furlough, how do we put it into place? And then how do we mobilise our IT solutions to get that into place? And more recently, there's probably been what desks people use, what chairs we need to send out. Now it's the time to, I think, plan and rather than react. So in the future, is it going to matter where your staff work from? Will staff be working more flexibly or remotely? What will you be doing with your office estate? Will you be investing in some offices, but perhaps closing others? Will those offices now become hubs for staff to congregate and co-create, or will they still be the heart of where your business is done? What technology are you going to implement? there's definitely a need now to have new ways to collaborate and socially connect. So what are you doing about that? Once you start planning that future vision, I know it's easy to say, let's plan what the future holds, particularly in this volatile workspace. Once you start planning it, you need to share that with your employees. You're going to need staff to probably think differently and embrace new opportunities. So you need to start telling them about that and ask what they think, engage and respond to what they think about your future vision. So there's no magic, I understand, in deciding how your business will operate and telling staff and listening to what they think. That's all pretty meat and drink stuff, but that will end up you forming a vision and an agreed plan. And once you have that plan in place, it takes you down to the basics of ensuring your employment documentation is mapped on how you operate in the future. Just a point on that, you may not be thinking how you're going to permanently operate in the future because you're in a panic state, and I've said that you perhaps should do so. You may have been thinking about it, but not formalised it, and you may have not told staff about it yet. All those things are really important parts of the step. But I can guarantee you from the employees that I deal with and the employers I deal with, your staff are thinking about it. It's probably dominating their thoughts at the moment in between homeschooling, because they're already wondering what's going to happen to them in the future. Some of them will be desperate to get back into the office, some will be desperate to stay at home, and some of them will have some kind of hybrid solution in between. They want some flexibility. Well, this is your time to lead that discussion. Right, so you've got your future plan, and let's look at more basics now. Although it was a reasonable adjustment to temporarily ask employees to work from home during a pandemic, if you want that to be more long-term, you'll probably need your employees' consent, and that will require a change to their contract of employment. While you're reviewing your contracts of employment, I want to set out some of those areas you want to consider. So the first is location. Your employment contract will almost certainly, at least it should, set out the location of work. Does that now need to be changed to something else? Should it be the home address? Is that the reality in the long term? If you are changing it to be the home address, what other clauses, if any, do you need around that? You'll probably still want to have the right to bring employees back into the office or a particular location as and when required for training, disciplinary matters, those sort of things. And if you do, you'll want to include an express clause to have that right to call employees in. You may want to link that employee to a place of work still, and that might be important if there's some sort of redundancy situation in the future when you close an office. If that place of work is going to be the home address, what other clauses are needed around that to control that situation? So I'll give you some examples. Will you need a contractual obligation for the employee to tell you if they plan to move? Is that important to you? And if they are planning to move, do you need to stipulate what area they're allowed to live under the contract? Because you may have a series of clients or customers in a location, and if your employee moves to Scotland and can't service, for example, East Midlands clients, that's going to be an issue for you. If the employee is going to move abroad, does that create tax implications or employment law implications in a new jurisdiction? You may want to govern where they can be. Or indeed, if you're going to pay them to travel to the office in the future, if they're living halfway across the country, that's going to cost you more money. So what can you reasonably stipulate in terms of where you want them to live in the future? Often when homework's first decided, employers will build in a probationary clause, and that may not be necessary in the future because people might be working from home already and you've trialled it out. That doesn't mean you won't want to put a clause in to say you can end the arrangement if necessary for business arrangements, and that stops you having to consult in the future about amending the contract and place of work if you have that right in to remove or change place of work in the future. Most contracts of employment contain confidentiality clauses. And in practice now, when people are working from home, it's much harder to police confidentiality. So you may want to put in an express clause that they've got the obligation to keep information secure at their home. Right to enter the home. Contractually, you will almost certainly want to have a right to enter an employee's home. There may be a need for it to service equipment, to install equipment, and to remove it on termination. You'll still be responsible for their health and safety, so you may want to enter the home to carry out risk assessments. But just bear in mind that this isn't an absolute right to enter the home. You can't turn up and kick the door down and say, we're coming in. What you have to do is argue a breach of contract. They don't give you the right to entry, but you would want to put it in. Hours of work. It depends how you approached it in lockdown and how you see your vision in the future, but certainly it'd be crucial to establish the boundaries of working time. For some, that might mean strictly observing office hours, and if that's the case, make sure your contract says that. It may be that staff can work more flexibly now, and you don't mind when they work as long as they do the hours, and again, that should be set out to manage those expectations. Or you could have some sort of hybrid in between, where there's a core set of hours where they must be available, and the other hours can be done more flexibly. That's a key area of dispute if you don't get it right. As are expenses. Often at the start of a home working relationship, if the employee wants to work from home, everything's rosy and happy until months pass and they realise they're paying higher heating bills or higher electricity, or their broadband's not up to it and they're paying more for that. So set out the expectations in the contract about what expenses will be met by the employer and in what circumstances, including if they're called into work, who's going to pay those travelling expenses. So now we have just taken stock, your plan, your vision for the future, because you've thought about that. You've done an audit of what changes are required to the contract of employment. How do you make those changes? Well, we've just discussed consulting with your staff about your vision and the plans for the future. And generally in those situations, if you've consulted employees about what your plans are, most people would agree. And that would include agreeing to a change in a contract of employment. If that's the case, then you formalise that agreement in writing and you've got a signature from the employees about it. There will sometimes be employees that don't want to agree, and what do you do about them? Well, provided you've followed suitable consultation before making changes, you can now consider dismissing them from their current terms, but offering to re-engage them immediately on their new terms. I should say, as a lawyer, this is a dismissal, so it won't be risk-free, and you should probably take legal advice before you do that. Also consider whether you are triggering collective consultation obligations, and you will be if you are considering to dismiss 20 or more at a single establishment. There may be a risk of redundancy in these situations. If you're closing a workplace and instead requiring people to work from home, and people don't want to work from home, they could argue that legally it's redundancy because there's a diminished need for them to work at the place they're employed to work. Right, I've got a poll question for you. Amanda, could you bring up the poll, please? Does your company have a home working policy? I should add, as far as you're aware. Okay. Well, it's 54% yes, 46% no, which is interesting. I wonder whether the ones that have no one working from home at the moment. I suspect actually you probably do. Well, now's the time to start thinking about it. I think I can share those. So yeah, 54% yes, 46% no. So half and half. If you haven't got one and you have staff working from home, then you'll probably need one. And if you have got one, you may want to review it in light of the changed circumstances, because you may have long-term and permanent home working in the future, and you've had a chance to experience what that means and what's important to you. Certainly, if you have a home working policy or you introduce one, you want to make staff aware of it, and you'll probably want them to sign to agree they've read it and they agree to the terms. I'll go through some of the essential things of a home working policy. There'll be more, but these are some of the key points. The first is around equipment. You need to determine what equipment's required and who will provide it. You may need to review your computer use policy as well in light of the changed circumstances. If staff are using their own equipment, you'll need to think about what permission they need to use that particular equipment and what rights you have to revoke their access or remove their connection, because this could be one of the weakest points of your system. And if you find out people are using old versions of Windows with security flaws, then you won't want them to be using your data or customer data on their exposed systems. And you may need to put software on their device to make it more secure, such as a VPN for a secure connection. So think about all those things and make sure you're getting those consents from your employees before it happens. If they are using your equipment, so let's say your laptops, can they use it for personal use? Can their kids do their homework on it? Can their partner use it? And if they can, does that create a security risk for you? And if they can't, you want to tell them, make sure they're aware they shouldn't be using it for personal use. Think about any confidential information they're using from home and what requirements are needed to protect it. Are they forbidden from printing hard copy documents? Is it all going to be connected and used behind a secure connection on their machines, on their laptops? If they can't print documents, you need to tell them that, because that could be a security risk and that could be a misconduct issue. Do they need to expressly know that they need to forbid household members from accessing that information, and what steps they're doing to try and protect that? Have they got a secure filing cabinet? I don't know many people that have secure filing cabinets at home, and they might not need it depending on how you operate your business. But lots of businesses have secure filing cabinets and require them to be locked and information kept in it. And if they're using the same information at home, why isn't it secure? Do you need to require it secure somewhere? And do you need to provide facilities for them to keep it secure? One of my favorite areas, because I'm sure there's going to be a newspaper article in it in the near future, is what do you do about disposal? If they can print documents and they are confidential, where's that stuff going? Have you provided a shredder? Are they buying their own shredders and you're paying for it? Have you got some sort of bin system that's confidential where you've got providers going to their houses to take away the waste? Have they got to transport to the office to be shredded? The reason why I think it's going to be a hot topic, because it's only a matter of time before someone's bin bag splits open and all these papers are going to be flying down the street, all this confidential information. It's going to be embarrassing for employers. You need to make sure you're trying to protect that by telling people what's expected. Health and safety assessments. You are still responsible for the health and safety of your employees as far as reasonably practicable. So that means taking assessments and reacting to it. And as I've said, I have seen employers more recently making sure that doing those assessments and that new chairs and desks are being sent out. There are still many employees working on their beds or in kitchens, and you need to do the best you can to keep them safe. One of the things to consider as well is that employees are now responsible for their own working time, including taking breaks. So you'll want your home working policy to say that staff should be taking breaks and they are responsible for it. Insurance can be a big issue. If you are supplying equipment for your staff, how is it being insured? Does your company insurance cover those devices and equipment on the premises of your employees? Check that it does, and if it doesn't, see if you can amend it. And if you can't, you'll need to obligate your employees to get suitable insurance for your equipment. And if they are, who's paying for that? But these things all need to be agreed and it needs to be looked at. It might be worth reminding your employees as well that they may need permission from their landlord, from the mortgage or their home insurance, that they can work from home. I've mentioned the right to enter the home. You'll want a contractual obligation and right to do that, but you'll also want to put that in the policy to manage those expectations. Code of home working conduct. I think any home working policy would benefit from having a code of conduct about working from home. Most people experienced how people have become more relaxed now they're working from home. I'm wearing a shirt today, probably for the first time in about 4 weeks. And if staff are becoming more relaxed about what they wear, what's going on in the background when they're working, then a code of conduct can really help to control that. It can stop people acting in a way below your expectations because they know what they are. And if they do act below your expectations, it's more reasonable for you to take action about it because there's a code of conduct. So think about what should be in your code of conduct and what's important to you. Your normal disciplinary and grievance procedure will probably apply in these circumstances, but think about whether it needs to be amended. I know that some employers are changing their rules slightly to prohibit employees from using work time for domestic, family or other commitments. So if they shouldn't be doing household chores during work time, running another business, engaging in childcare, then you want to set that out and make it clear that it's a disciplinary offence. So that concludes what I want to say about getting the best from your staff by getting the framework right. I'll hand over to Emma.
Thank you, Christopher. And there were some really interesting points there, weren't there, regarding some of these policies and things. So thank you very much. Right, hopefully everybody can see my screen. So good morning, everybody. My name's Emma Browning. Just a little bit about my background, as Christopher very kindly said, an experienced HR professional, as I'm sure many of you are in the room. So I've had the privilege to work with some fantastic businesses, both locally, Oxford Instruments, which was a manufacturing and engineering business, and Porsche Cars and Harley Davidson, where I was HR director looking after the EMEA region. But I set up Meraki HR 6 years ago now, and we support and work with HR teams, when they need that extra pair of hands or a specific project that perhaps they don't have the experience in managing. And we work with startups and scale-up businesses. But essentially, we're working with them to help them create great places to work that deliver great business results. So I'm going to be talking about managing your people through periods of significant change. And it's hard to believe, but a year ago today, on February the 3rd, 2020, there were only 3 cases of COVID that had been confirmed in the UK. And many people were saying that this was a blip on the horizon and it would all be over and done and dusted in a month. Well, here we are. I think it's something like 318 days later. And unfortunately, it's not all over. But I can remember last year attending a meeting with a client on the 10th of March, and we were discussing a major reorganisation of their business at the time. And this impacted 150 people. So this was a fairly, sizable project. There were no planned job losses, though. This wasn't about job losses. This was about restructuring with a need to change lots of different job roles, reporting lines. So we were having quite a long period of consultation with these people. And we needed to make sure everybody was on board with the change. And we're going to talk a bit more about some change in a moment. But I suggested to the MD at the time that we might need to reconsider the timings of this restructure if we go into lockdown, I said. And do you know what the MD said? He said, don't worry, that's not going to happen. We'll be fine. But obviously, as we know, we did go into lockdown literally about a week later. So on the 23rd of March, we went into lockdown 1. And, I think we probably all had very different sort of reactions to that first lockdown, didn't we? We went into shock, maybe. We went into denial. We might have been angry. We might have been frightened, actually, or scared of what the future held for us. And that's shown in this model here, this change model that I've used. Now, there's lots of different change models out there about how we manage change. And this is one of the simplest 4-stage models. But what we know about change is that people experience and accept change at very different rates. And I'm one of those people, I love change. I wouldn't have done my master's in the management of innovation and change if I didn't love change. So I'm probably one of those very annoying people that's really positive about change when it happens. But I also understand enough about people to know that not everybody reacts that way. I know myself, I probably last March went straight into that exploration stage. So I went straight in at stage 3, and I was quite keen to think about, well, how can I work differently? What can I do differently to make this lockdown work? Because obviously I've got a business to run. If I'm honest, when we went into this 3rd lockdown in January, I honestly think I went back to that stage 2. I was quite angry about the fact we went into lockdown, thinking that I'd followed the rules and, why on earth were we in this position? So I went back into that angry, but also quite fearful stage that, this is really serious and things don't seem to be getting better. And I'm actually quite worried about this now. So we do have that kind of going forwards and backwards, I think, sometimes when we're going through a period of change. But how does change impact our people and how they act and behave at work? So if we think about that first stage, that status quo stage, when we're perhaps in shock and denial, some of the things that you might see people doing if they're in that first stage of shock and denial is that they may just carry on as normal, as though nothing has happened, nothing's changed. They might not want to talk about what's going on, and they might not even want to consider working in new ways. So it's almost that denial. They're not acknowledging that there's a problem at all. And quite often when people are in those situations of shock or denial, what you might see is people withdrawing. So they might become very quiet. So somebody perhaps in the team who is quite perhaps sociable and gregarious might suddenly become very quiet and withdraw from the team, get their head down, be getting on with it and doing good work, but you just don't see that interaction from them anymore. So that's some of the behaviours you might see in that stage 1. In stage 2, where people are perhaps being a bit disruptive, they're angry, they're scared, you might see that people are perhaps being a bit difficult. I'm sure we've all been in those meetings where you have that person who's constantly putting their hand up and saying, well, this isn't going to work, you know, this is a load of rubbish. So, you know, it's not necessarily because they're being difficult. It could be because they're in this stage where they're actually concerned, worried, angry and frightened about the change and what's going on. So they could be being difficult, not accepting these new ways of working. They could also just become a bit short-fused. And we've all, I'm sure, experienced this, you know, where you're really under the cosh, or perhaps you are angry or worried. You know that you're a bit snappy. And when you start to see people behaving like that, again, they could be in this situation. They could just be creating problems in the team as well. And so you start to think, what's going on with this person? You know, this person was normally a great team worker, a great colleague, but now they're starting to cause or create problems amongst the team. And then we go into, you know, this exploration and acceptance stage. So this is where you'll start to see people starting to actually adapt to the new ways of working. I know for myself, it was suddenly all about Zoom and Microsoft Teams. And whilst we've been working as a business on Teams for 5 years, I'd never actually used Microsoft Teams to hold a meeting because we'd always met in person. So all of a sudden we were starting to have to adapt to these new ways of working, whether it was from home, whether it was going into the office with masks on, whether it was using Zoom. We were all starting to look at ways to work differently and just getting on with it. So that's when we started to accept that actually, you know, this change is here, it's happening, and we've got to get on with it and we've got to accept it. And then in this last stage, rebuilding and commitment, that's when you may start to see people raising questions about the new ways of working. They're really getting engaged with the process, whatever the change process might be. And they're suggesting new ways of working to you, which is fantastic because you're really getting that commitment from them to these new ways of working. And the other side of it is you may see some of these people then actually starting to champion and bring other people along with them who may be sort of in some of those earlier stages of that change model. So they're going to help and encourage people to accept and commit to those new ways of working. And some people might get to that exploration and acceptance stage earlier than others, as we said. And that's a great way for you as well, perhaps if you're an HR or a manager in a business, to think, well, maybe they could be one of my change champions. And that's when it's worth bringing people like that on board to actually help you to get any change accepted within the business, because, you know, they've got experience, they may be a peer of that person. So those people are really going to help you to get other people on board. So that's one of the ways we might see people acting and behaving around change. But I thought it would actually be interesting to hear about how you're all feeling about change. Because, you know, I'm sure all of us are perhaps in a different phase of this change model at the moment. So we thought we'd set up another quick poll. We like a quick poll here this morning at Freeths, about where you are in that change management curve. So now you've heard those descriptions about how people are behaving. Where are you? Are you in stage 1 still, stage 2, stage 3, or stage 4? So it'd be interesting to see where you're all at. And see, we've still got a few people thinking about it, and that's absolutely fine, because you need to be sure about where you are. Okay, nearly there. I think we just got 4 people. maybe, yeah, okay, we're getting there. And if you don't want to vote, that's absolutely fine. Okay, so we're all finished. So that looks like we've got 7% of people in stage 1, 3% in stage 2, with a bit of a split towards the end of people in stage 3 and stage 4. So really interesting, and I think that just highlights the point, doesn't it, that we're all potentially at different stages of the change curve, and we're 10 months into that journey now. And I think that highlights that, you know, the need for people to understand, particularly if you're working, you know, with management and leadership teams, that we all get to a different stage in that change curve at a different rate. And for managers and for HR to really help the business manage change, you need to really understand how people react and how people behave during periods of change, you know, to help them manage that. So I'm going to stop sharing those poll results now, but thank you. That was a really interesting activity to do with you all this morning. So what I want to do now is share something with you called the reflection window. And this is something that I've used with people, particularly over the last 10 months, around, you know, working differently. But you can also apply this and just change the wording slightly to make it work for all kinds of change. But have been using this with groups and with companies where they are working very differently. And it's a really simple activity that you could maybe conduct in team meetings to get people to talk about what's working for them in terms of the new way of working and what's not working for them. So I've used it, as I said, with some of our clients recently to help them engage with their teams and to explore the highs and lows of the new way of working. So as you can see, you've got these two axes, the old way and the new way, and let go, what you want to let go of and what you want to keep. And it's just a really good conversation starter. So you could use it maybe in an open forum discussion like this. If you had a Zoom meeting with everybody visible, you could perhaps break out into breakout rooms, maybe get people who are not working together on a day-to-day basis to go into those groups together. So you're encouraging conversation and collaboration, which I know Lisa will talk about is an important thing with employee engagement and well-being. And then they can share their ideas and their thoughts with the whole group about what's working, what isn't, what would they like to go back to, what would they like to make sure you keep hold of in those new ways of working. And as Christopher said earlier, one of the things that's really important is talking to people. So in a way, some of this work could actually help you shape those home working policies or your codes of conduct, because all of those kind of things can be brought into these discussions using that reflection window. So it can be a great way to actually put some of your policies and processes in place by engaging with your employees and actually asking them what's working and what isn't. So shaping that future way of work together. So how can HR help the business then during periods of change? So as we've alluded to, you know, it's really important that any of your managers who are going to be involved in change need that training and support to understand the change management process and how it impacts people's behaviour and how they can support their people through change. So it isn't just a case of, well, here we go, this is what we're doing, and then we wonder 3 months later why it's not worked and why people aren't on board. So giving your managers that support and training they need to really help them understand change and how to bring people along with them, I think is a fantastic idea. But I think it's also then important that you provide support and training for employees as well, because as we saw in that poll, not everybody reacts to change in a positive way. And some people will take longer to accept change than others. So helping, again, your employees to understand that it's okay to still be at stage 1 10 months later, and others are at stage 4. Helping people to understand that we're all different in any environment is fantastic, but helping them to understand why we're different during periods of change is important. So maybe giving them support on that, helping them to become resilient to change, because change is part of our working world now. whether it was COVID or whether you were going through a restructure as a business or just changing the way you work. Change is such a huge part of our working world today, helping employees to become resilient to that and used to dealing with change will actually help managers and the business succeed in their change efforts. And maybe, as we've just talked about, setting up sessions with employee groups and using that reflection window to help you determine your future ways of working would be another really great idea. So I think it's also important when we get to the end of lockdown 3, and we seriously hope this is the last lockdown, to think about creating a change management process based on all the things that you've learned, because I'm sure if, like me and Christopher and his team and Lisa, we're all quite frazzled, and I'm sure you guys are as well. So taking some time to actually reflect on what you've learned, I think is really important. And there will be so many things we've learned from the last 10 months. You know, I've started to jot down things I've learned, and I'm already kind of on a big sheet of A4. So I'm sure all of you will have some fantastic things that you've learned and perhaps haven't realised yet. So really important to do that, because some of those learnings from the last 12 months will help you to deal with any future changes in the business. And, you know, you could then include in this change management process the reasons for the changes that you need to make. So it's always really important when you're going through change to talk about the reason needed for the change. Christopher talked about having a compelling vision for the future. So having a compelling vision for the future after the changes have been made and they've been successfully implemented is really important, so that people can see where you want to go and why you're going there. Also having a mechanism or a way that people can raise questions about the changes and how they'll be informed of progress. So I used to call it a change check-in meeting. So very different to having a one-to-one or a catch-up about workload or performance. This is purely to sit down with people and talk to them about change, how they're feeling about it, what questions have they got. That can be done on a one-to-one basis, but it can also be done as a group. So I just wanted to finish with this. So, you know, Charles Darwin, we all know who Charles Darwin was. And I think it's important to say, you know, as HR in today's volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world, it's all about helping the business to manage its people and adapt to change. And the last 12 months have really shown us as a profession how important it is for us to be able to help and support businesses through change. And boy, have we had to rise to that challenge in HR this year. We've had to learn about furlough, as Christopher said, and work with lawyers like Freeths and Christopher to get our letters, our policies, and new ways of working in place in record time. And I have to say, you've all kind of risen to the challenge. So thank you for your support on that. We've had to keep employees and managers motivated whilst keeping ourselves motivated too. And that's not easy, but in the main, we've done it, and we're all still here to tell the tale, which is good news. But when the madness is over, take a step back to reflect on what you've learned, because there will be a loss, as we've just said. And make sure you do capture this and put it into a process and share your learnings with the management and leadership team. Get their support to put these change management processes or training for people and their employees in place, because this is how we can really demonstrate that HR adds value to the business. So thank you for listening to that. I'm going to pass over to my colleague now, Lisa, who's going to talk to you more about employee wellbeing.
Thank you, Emma. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too long talking about myself, because I would rather talk to you about the employee wellbeing engagement side of what we're focusing on today. So just in summary, as was said earlier on, I'm a chartered psychologist and psychotherapist. I started out life as a primary school teacher a long time ago, so it should be holding me a good stead right now. I have my own practice, which I've been running for about 10 years. My company's It's Time for Change. I've noticed a typo on there. And 1 day a week, especially 1 day a week, I do psychotherapy with clients. Actually, that's increased at the moment because the number of mental health problems have really increased since the pandemic started last year. And the rest of the time I focus my work in organisations supporting leadership and HR people primarily. And I'm really all about using my approach, my background as a psychologist, to look at what actually works and what doesn't work. So lots and lots of companies I go into are like smiling broadly, or they used to be smiling broadly, saying, we've got this amazing, you know, pitch and putt thing in my reception area, and we've got this, like, you know, lovely bowls of fruit and so on, we're ticking all the boxes. And actually, it's, you know, does that really make a difference? Lots of people got mental health first aiders. Great. Do they make a difference? What's their impact? So it's all about actually working with the right people, looking at what works and what doesn't. My motto, and I like the fact that, Christopher, you changed the title of this at the start, because I completely understand what you're saying about, it's like, it feels like we're trying to drag people along for the sake of our business. But my motto is that when we get people right, we get business right. And it's about doing what we can to support our employees, because we know that if they are happy at coming to work, if they're happy at engaging, and they feel that they can be trusted and they can speak out and they can be their best, then they're going to work brilliantly. They're going to talk well about our company. They're going to connect well. And all that kind of comes back to our culture, which Christopher was talking about earlier on, and Emma has talked about as well. So why are we talking about this? Well, from my point of view, as I've already said, we know that rates of mental health and problems and challenges to well-being have really been challenged since the pandemic, and we have to take that seriously. We can no longer, I think it's that's just zoomed on. Sorry, I was going to take that back. We can no longer just kind of consider this as a tick box, and we can no longer just assume that this is the fluffy stuff, or this is just about people with mental health problems. We know that employee wellbeing engagement impacts on people's productivity. And a big research paper that came out last year by LLoyd showed the return on investment. So for every £1 that companies are spending, on average, they're getting £5 back, which is a significant return on investment. And where that was, the money was spent on organisation-wide support rather than targeting individuals, that return on investment could be £9 for every pound spent. It was significant. So this is really a business case. So for those of you who are, I know there'll be lots and lots of managers and companies going, we don't need to worry about all this stuff. Actually, you do, because there's a really strong business case. Not to mention the health and safety legal responsibility that you have as a company, in terms of, you're having to assess what the risks are to people's well-being, in terms of their welfare, in terms of their safety at work. And that includes their mental safety. We're not talking about sort of tripping over something and banging your head and that's traditional way of thinking about it. So we can't afford not to be thinking about employee wellbeing and engagement. And when I ask the question about work and how that impacts on our engagement, how that impacts on our sense of well-being and on our mental health, traditionally people would always say to me, oh, it really increases my stress levels, and I just have this sense of anxiety all the time, this sense of overwhelm. And there's kind of traditionally there's lots of negative associations, but actually our work should provide us with that sense of routine and structure. It should provide us with a sense of meaning and purpose and independence, and a sense of status and connection with people and being fulfilled. And that's the thing we need to refocus on, because that's what's being challenged at the moment. So I'm going to just take us a little bit through the brain, not in any huge detail, be pleased to know, but I always find this really fascinating, because when people have a little bit of an insight into what's going on, they not only have a better understanding for themselves, but the people around them, and that's hugely important. And I think we all should be taught this at school, in terms of knowing how our brain, what's going on in our brain, determines our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviours. If we had a little bit of knowledge, it goes a long way in terms of helping us to take greater control, being able to reduce stress, being able to reduce our anxiety, being able to perform better, being able to relate to people better. So we know that when we're supported to feel safe, and that means knowing what's expected of me, knowing if it's okay to take risks, knowing how I'm supposed to work, what that looks like, knowing that if I don't get something done, I'm not going to be shouted at, having that sense of psychological safety. When we know that, our brain is a great place. It quietens our threat detection system so that we can just focus on the work in hand rather than the emotional turmoil going on in our brain. So when we think about the brain and what's going on in it, we have a little thing called an amygdala, and it's a tiny little, I always liken it to a security officer. And so if you imagine your little security officer, he's constantly scanning the environment, looking for things that might be a little bit challenging, might be something that's going to present as, you know, I've just been given a huge piece of work and I've got an unrealistic deadline, or I've got something to do, I've got 2 meetings that clash, I don't know which one to go to, whatever that might be. You've got to sort out an employee who's got some issues and you're feeling anxious about that. There is a trigger in our environment, and our security officer, our amygdala, spots that and starts jumping them down. And it increases our emotional arousal. And if you think about a bucket filling it up with water, it gets to a point where it overflows. And we need to help people understand what their early warning signs are, and we need to be able to spot them. So when you're working with staff and you're supporting staff, how well are you and how well are line managers and how well are colleagues for each other noticing those early warning signs? Because if we don't and our emotional arousal gets too high, it literally hijacks our cognitive brain. So this part of our brain, which is our most recently developed, which is where we do all our clever stuff, like our problem solving and our planning and our kind of reasoning and everything we need to do our job well, that gets hijacked. And then we become really hypervigilant. So when someone forgets to invite us to a meeting, our amygdala starts saying, well, that's because we're next out the door. They don't really want us involved. Or if someone kind of we're on a Zoom call in a meeting and someone doesn't say hello, it's like, oh, what have I done wrong? And you suddenly start worrying. And we can all think of times when we've been in those situations, and it's usually when our emotional arousal is high. And the problem is it creates this black and white thinking. You know, you might have heard the saying, glass half full, glass half empty. If we end up being in a situation where everything's black and white, it's like I'm literally can only focus with my spotlight on the problem because I haven't got my cognitive capacity to be able to look at the other perspectives, other options. That really gets us stuck in this kind of cycle of going round and round and not really being able to perform, not really being able to engage. And we have to take it seriously because evidence shows that mental noise, the stuff going on in our brain that is not sort of conducive to us working well, affects our ability to process information by up to 80%. That's significant. So if you've got people in your company who have got loads of stuff going on, emotion, and I'm not talking about mental health labels and diagnoses and so on, I'm just talking about someone who's feeling stressed, who's feeling anxious, who's just feeling a bit overwhelmed, who's going through that change cycle that Emma's just been describing brilliantly, and who's feeling fearful. If you've got people who are in that state, and I would suggest that a lot of people are in that state right now, then it's going to reduce their cognitive capacity. It's not their fault, that's just the reality. So we have to prioritise reducing the emotional arousal. We have to help people understand what their early warning signs are. We have to notice those for each other and be able to feed back and say, you look a bit stressed, or you look a bit, you're a bit kind of short-tempered, or you've made a mistake. You don't normally make mistakes like that. Is everything okay? So just beginning to kind of have those check-ins that Emma was talking about as well. And knowing and prioritising self-care, so actually making sure, and I think Christopher alluded to this, it's actually about making sure that people are looking after themselves, making sure that people are taking their breaks and are making sure that they are doing what they need to do to bring their emotional arousal down. And it's also about challenging that notion of stress. So we know that we have to be in that orange zone, which is my zone of optimal performance. If I'm to the left of that, my low bored state, I'm not going to be very productive. If I'm stressed, I'm not going to be productive. Stress is high emotional arousal. Being stretched is good. Stress isn't. So we need to start challenging that notion of, if you're not stressed, you're not working hard enough. If you're stressed, you're not working well enough, because your brain can't do the two. One thing I'd also encourage you as well to be aware of, and to make line managers in particular aware of this, is that we only see what is very visible, very, very evident. So when people come to work, when they show, whether that's on a Zoom meeting or however we're seeing each other, we only see what people allow us to see. So we might see someone appearing engaged and appearing kind of their presence, but actually how often when we say, how are you, do we really probe? Do we really take time to find out how are they really? If someone actually often, opened up and said, oh, actually, this is going on, that's going on, I'd be like, oh, I haven't got time for that. We expect people to say, yeah, I'm fine. But actually, underneath the surface, there can be a huge amount going on that we have no idea about. And if we don't know about it, it impacts on our ability to engage with other people, our ability to do our job well, our ability to perform. So we have to, this is about having a holistic approach to supporting employees, rather than just the tasks that we give them. Because if they've got these concerns, and lots of people will right now, again, there's evidence to show there's lots and lots of research reports coming out, then people will have this emotional arousal that impacts their ability to engage. So it's about challenging what you see and really thinking below the surface. So in terms of what works, I'm going to take you through a series of resources that I'm just going to refer you to, so you can go and check these out later on. In terms of emotional needs audit, the link here will take you to a really simple emotional needs audit that people can do for themselves, you can do with people, which helps people identify what's going well for them in terms of, do they feel a sense of control? Do they feel a sense of achievement? Do they feel a sense of connection to people in their company right now? If those needs are not met well enough, it does impact on their ability to perform. Sleep, so important, and we all know that, but we kind of go, it's one of those luxuries, I haven't got time to sleep at the moment, and actually we need to sleep. And I had a brilliant conversation with a guy called Nick Whitten, who's a sleep expert, and I've got a link there to hear him talk all about really practical ways that companies need to be thinking about sleep. So I'll let you check that out, but he's full of amazing advice. Training, there's been lots that have been talked about today, whether it's about change management, whether it's about emotional intelligence and being able to communicate with each other, whether it's about your workplace culture, leadership, whatever it might be, get the training involved to kind of support you with that. You're not expected to know everything, and your managers aren't either. Helping managers have conversations, and as Emma said, lots of managers will have their role is about engaging people, but they don't really know how to go about it. They don't really know how to have a conversation. It's not part of their natural skill set. They don't feel confident. So there's a framework that they can check out. Obviously, signposting people to, if you've got mental health first aiders or whoever else is relevant in your organisation. CPD, so helping people understand. So for example, if you've got mental health first aiders, that's great. I don't know if you're involved with kind of liaising with them, but make sure that they're actually being used, make sure they're having an impact, because they're an amazing resource, and so many of them are not being used well enough. So it's actually just checking that out and making sure that people are getting the extra skills or knowledge, or maybe it's just the confidence they need to fulfill their role. EAPs, most of you, I'm guessing, will have those, but making sure that people are using them. Lots of them have the support for counselling and so on, and many employees don't use it or aren't aware of it, whereas they could just pick up the phone and speak to someone and get some support. Really, really helpful to promote that. Emotional transitions, I'm not going to go too much into because Emma's covered that brilliantly, but it's that whole sense of leading successful change, actually making sure it's part of what you focus on. This image I love, because when you look at it, it's like, oh gosh, this feels like it's how it's been for the last nearly a year. It feels very, very bleak. And I think when we have to stop, and we have to take stock of where we're at, and we have to encourage people to do the same. We can't just keep ploughing on forward without stopping and pausing, thinking, actually, what's going on right now? And how are people feeling? And when we're working remotely, it's being aware of, it's a completely different way of working for some people. It's not just a case of doing a normal job somewhere else. It is a case of you're doing your role and potentially in a very, very different way. So actually, if you had a new person coming into your company, you'd be supporting them, settling in, you'd be helping them know what's expected of them, you'd be familiarising them with all the processes and systems. We need to be doing that when we're working, and when people are working from home as well. Really important. And in terms of helping people think about where they are, if they look at this image, are they kind of coming up to that mountain? Are they thinking, I can't possibly climb that mountain, I've climbed too many of those already in the last year? Help people do some scaling. And this is really, really useful. Companies sometimes use that for themselves. Sometimes, as individuals, sometimes they use it within group meetings. So at the start of a meeting, say, right, where is everybody today? And why are you at 6? Because you were at 7 yesterday, what's happened? Or what could we do today? What would help today move you from a 6 to a 7? It's beginning to increase that sense of awareness, which we really need right now. And finally, just to talk you through very quickly, I'm not going to go into any detail because I want to have some time for Q&A. I'm really acutely aware we're running out of time. But when we're remote working, there are lots of things that we can be doing. So Emma's really talked about check-ins, and it's about asking your employees what works for them. Some people want a quick text message, a quick phone call every day. Some people want to have a one-to-one every 2 or 3 days. It's knowing what works. The informal but frequent works best. Helping people identify these signs that we've already talked about and the strategies that work for them. So if when they feel, after 25 minutes to sit at their desk, do they need to have 5 minutes away from their desk? And how are you making sure that happens? Be realistic. If you're homeschooling and everything else going on at the moment, we can't achieve the same as we were before. We're not superhuman. And it's informing and letting people know that that's okay. We don't expect them to be superhuman. Creating routine and boundaries around what you're doing and how you're doing it. Social emotional connections are really important, a hugely important emotional need. And also research last year showed that the 16 to 29-year-old bracket are the most isolated, most lonely right now. It's not the older generation who we traditionally think that of. So how we can connect those. Exercise, we know that we have to physically get out and move. And lots of companies now are using great apps such as Stride Kick, which is where teams are working together to see how many people can get in how many steps, and they've got a bit of a competition. There's also, I'm not going to go into detail about all these because there's a lot here, and I think I've covered most of them. What I would say, just to finish with, is your managers are your key. It's a bit like Emma was saying earlier on. Your managers are the people who need to be having those conversations, need to be supporting their teams, and they need to have the skills and the confidence and knowledge to be able to do that. So some of the resources here are signposting are really good for managers just to check out in terms of having good conversations. I'm going to pass back to Christopher now for the last 2 minutes. I got that in under 20 minutes.
Excellent. Thanks. Great timing to everybody involved. Thank you for that. We've got 2 minutes to go. And actually, there are no questions in the Q&A box, so it gives me a chance to round up the end. That's hopefully because we've covered everything you wanted to know, rather than the Q&A box not working. If that isn't the case, then please get in contact with us for any questions you may have. And certainly, I know that at least half of you haven't got home working policy, so you should be asking me how you get one and how you draft one. And I took loads of notes when Emma and Lisa were talking, so thank you for that. Just to comment on some of the things that I was taking notes about, all of it was useful. I'm not surprised there's an increase in mental health issues, and I'm not surprised actually there's an issue with younger people as well, because they're people that haven't got the facilities to work comfortably from home. So great to hear that there's a real return on investment for investing in those things, so making sure making a difference. And actually it's really interesting to hear about, it's not just about mental health diagnosis, it's about that emotionally overwhelming and dealing with that. So all that's really useful, so thank you for that. I mentioned in my talk about the need to have a future plan, and I'm conscious it's easy to say it and difficult to do, so I'm really grateful that Emma's looked at the reflection window to give you a tool. So if you haven't done that plan yet and you don't know how to go about it, you've got a tool now to start reflecting on what's working, what's not working, and what you might want to keep. So really, all really useful there, I think. I wrote down a quote that Lisa mentioned, which was, if we get people right, we get the business right. I think it's the same for the law. If you get the people right, you get the law right, because if you use the strategies that Emma spoke about in change management, and you're helping them not be overwhelmed so they can actually be receptive to think about those things, when you get to changing the contract, it's easy. They're all on board, and just changing a contract is a very simple thing. So thanks for those tips. We'll be sending you as attendees a copy of the slides today and our contact details, so please follow up with us if you've got any queries. Other than that, thank you again to Emma and Lisa, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much, everybody.